He exists first as a whisper, a flicker at the edge of vision. He is the gray man, a specter haunting the periphery of a world preoccupied with its own grand agonies. In the sprawling, indifferent cityscapes of Depression-era America, a nation wrestling with breadlines and gangsters, he moves unnoticed. He is an old man, stooped and grandfatherly, with a disarming smile and watery, pleading eyes. His appearance is a masterful piece of camouflage, a costume of harmless frailty draped over a vessel of absolute horror. The mind that animates this shuffling form is not merely broken, it is a cathedral of pain, meticulously constructed over decades, where piety and perversion have become fused into a singular, monstrous faith. How is such a creature made? Is it born in the faulty wiring of the brain, a genetic curse passed down through generations like a tarnished heirloom? Or is it forged in the cold crucibles of childhood, hammered into shape by cruelty and neglect until all that remains is a twisted effigy of a man? How does it operate for decades, a phantom collecting its tithe of innocence while the world looks on, or more accurately, looks away? The story of Albert Fish is not merely the chronicle of a predator. It is an autopsy of a collective failure, an examination of the societal cracks through which the most vulnerable can fall, and a chilling reminder that the most profound evil often wears the most unremarkable face. Before the final accounting, before the name Albert Fish became synonymous with cannibalistic depravity, there were only the numbers. An unknown quantity of children, perhaps as few as 5, perhaps more than 100, vanished into the gray anonymity he personified. For years, his crimes were a scattered collection of disconnected tragedies, the isolated sorrows of poor families whose pleas were lost in the static of a struggling nation. This is the story of how that static was finally pierced, how the whispers consolidated into a scream, and how the gray man was dragged from the shadows into the horrifying light. It is a story about the relentless arithmetic of suffering and the terrible weight of what we owe the dead. The pathology that would become Albert Fish was seeded in poisoned soil. Born Hamilton Fish in 1870, he entered a lineage already riddled with mental decay. His family tree was a gallery of afflictions: an uncle who died in a state asylum, a brother institutionalized, a sister plagued by delusions, a mother who heard voices. He inherited a predisposition for madness, a blueprint for a mind that would eventually fracture under pressure. The first pressure point came early. His father, a man of some standing, died when Hamilton was only 5. The family's subsequent destitution led to his placement in the St. John's Orphanage in Washington, D.C., a decision that would prove catastrophic. The orphanage was not a sanctuary, it was an incubator for his nascent horrors. Within its austere walls, under a veneer of religious instruction, a brutal shadow curriculum was taught. It was a place of institutionalized sadism, where discipline was meted out with whips and paddles, where pain was a daily sacrament. The older boys, steeped in this culture of violence, initiated the younger ones into rituals of degradation. It was here that Fish first encountered the unholy trinity that would govern his entire existence: pain, religion, and excretion. He learned that beatings could produce a strange, ecstatic pleasure. He was forced into coprophagia. The lines between piety and punishment, between agony and arousal, blurred and then dissolved completely. The orphanage did not create the monster, but it provided the tools and the theology to build it. His hunting ground was not a single sinister house on a hill, but the sprawling, anonymous expanse of the American city. He was a creature of transience, a ghost in the machine of urban life. He drifted from one shabby boarding house to another, a perpetual tenant of the nation's margins. This nomadic existence was his greatest asset. In cities like New York, with their teeming populations and constant churn, a person could simply cease to be. A child, especially a child of the poor, could vanish from a street corner, and the ripples of their absence would barely disturb the surface. Fish required no isolated farm, no soundproofed basement. His laboratory was the cheap room he rented for the week. His lure was the promise of a job or a party. And his escape was the simple act of boarding a train and disappearing back into the crowd. The first true signs of the burgeoning horror were turned inward. Long before he inflicted his compulsions on others, he practiced on himself. His body became a canvas for his deranged piety. He would whip himself with a nail-studded paddle, seeking a state of religious ecstasy through self-flagellation. He began a lifelong practice of inserting needles into his groin and abdomen, dozens of them, pushing them deep into the flesh until they were lost. This was his private martyrdom, a secret conversation between him and a god of his own making, a god who demanded suffering. Outwardly, he constructed a fragile facade of normalcy. He married, fathered 6 children, and worked as a house painter. But this domestic shell was thin. His wife eventually abandoned him, unable to bear his escalating perversions. His children became his first captive audience, subjected to beatings that straddled the line between discipline and sadistic ritual. The monster was testing the walls of its cage. The world outside provided the perfect enabling conditions for his evil to flourish. The Roaring Twenties gave way to the Great Depression, and the nation plunged into economic despair. Poverty became a great tenderizer, making families desperate and children vulnerable. A kind old man offering a job for a son or a trip to a party for a daughter was not a threat. He was a godsend. Law enforcement was a patchwork of local agencies with little to no communication between them. A child missing in New York was of no concern to the police in Philadelphia. Fingerprinting was nascent, criminal profiling non-existent. Against this backdrop of systemic chaos and individual desperation, Albert Fish's camouflage of old age and gentle manners was perfectly tailored. He was the unassuming predator thriving in a collapsing ecosystem, a wolf who had mastered the appearance of a lost sheep. The pattern began to coalesce in the 1920s. His attacks grew bolder, escalating from assaults to murder. He became a connoisseur of trust, a master manipulator of parental hope. He scanned the classified sections of newspapers not for work, but for opportunities. He sought out families advertising for farmhands or laborers, using the pretext of hiring their sons to gain entry into their homes. He would arrive as Frank Howard or John Davis, a different name for every town. He was charming, polite, and deeply sympathetic to their plight. He would speak of his own fictional farm, of his lonely life, of his desire to help. He was an artist, and his medium was deception. Once trust was established, he would select his target. It was almost always a child, usually one who was bright, beautiful, and beloved. The selection was part of his ritual. He did not want a child who would not be missed. He savored the pain of the family. He would invent a pretext for being alone with the child, a trip to the city for a birthday party, a visit to a relative. The parents, won over by his kindly act and desperate for the small wage or opportunity he offered, would agree. The child would walk away with the smiling old man, stepping out of their life and into his private abattoir. The machinery of his evil was brutally simple. He carried his tools in a worn satchel, a butcher knife, a meat cleaver, a small saw. The instruments of a handyman were repurposed for deconstruction. His years as a house painter had given him a practical, dispassionate understanding of anatomy. He knew how to take things apart. The murders were not acts of frenzied rage. They were methodical, ritualistic procedures. They were sacrifices. In his warped theology, he was an instrument of God performing a holy duty. The act of killing was followed by dismemberment and ultimately cannibalism. He would cook and eat parts of his victims, a grotesque communion he believed brought him closer to the divine. This was the apex of his pathology, the ultimate fusion of his violent sexual and religious urges. The psychological landscape of Albert Fish was a wasteland of contradictions. He was a doting grandfather who wrote loving letters to his own children while simultaneously composing taunting, obscene letters to the families of the children he had murdered. This ability to compartmentalize was his most terrifying mental feat. He could inhabit the role of the harmless old man so completely because, in a part of his mind, he believed it. His religious fanaticism was the central pillar of his psychosis. He saw biblical precedent for his actions, citing the story of Abraham and Isaac as justification. He was not a murderer. He was a divine executioner. His self-mutilation was not a sign of madness but of sainthood. Each needle inserted into his pelvis was a prayer, each lash of the whip a penance. He had constructed an internally consistent, hermetically sealed reality where his monstrosity was recast as martyrdom. He was not insane in a way that rendered him dysfunctional. His insanity was his function. There were moments tantalizingly close when the truth almost surfaced. He was arrested multiple times for petty larceny and sending obscene letters through the mail, but his grandfatherly act always secured his release. No one connected the mild-mannered deviant with the growing list of missing children. In 1928, after he abducted and murdered 4-year-old Billy Gaffney in Brooklyn, a witness gave a description of the strange old man who had lured the boy away. The description was published, but it led nowhere. He was a ghost, leaving behind only grief and confounding clues. In another instance, a landlord grew suspicious of the foul odors emanating from Fish's rented room. He reported it, but by the time anyone investigated, Fish was gone. These near discoveries were tragic what-ifs, moments where a single thread, if pulled, might have unraveled his web of horror years earlier, saving unknown lives. Instead, each escape reinforced his delusion of divine protection, making him bolder and more reckless. The zenith of his horror, the period of his most prolific activity, spanned from the mid-1920s to the early 1930s. He was a phantom adrift on the currents of the Great Depression, moving from state to state, a traveling salesman of death. The true number of his victims from this era is a matter of grim speculation. He confessed to murders in Delaware, in New York, in states he could no longer name. His confidence was absolute. He walked into homes, charmed families, and walked out with their children, leaving behind nothing but a false name and a void that would never be filled. He existed as two entities, the public Albert Fish, a lonely, eccentric but harmless old handyman, and the private monster, a high priest of a cannibalistic cult of one performing his sacred rites in rented rooms. This dual existence was maintained with meticulous care, a testament to his profound and functional madness. The victims were rendered invisible by circumstance. They were the children of the poor, the marginalized, the desperate. Their disappearances were often reported to indifferent authorities who classified them as runaways. In a time of mass displacement and social upheaval, a missing child was a tragic but unremarkable statistic. To understand the scale of the loss, one must look past the numbers and see the faces. There was Frances McDonnell, abducted in 1924. There was Billy Gaffney, vanished in 1927. And there was Grace Budd, a 10-year-old girl from Manhattan whose story would ultimately become the key to his undoing. She was, by all accounts, a bright and happy child, beloved by her parents and her older brother Edward. Her family was struggling like so many others. When a kindly old farmer named Frank Howard answered their newspaper ad seeking work, it felt like a prayer answered. He was gentle, He was pious, and he offered a future for their son. He became a welcome guest in their home, a temporary grandfather. The Budd family saw a savior. They had no way of knowing they had invited the abyss itself to their dinner table. Society in its vast, preoccupied state looked away. The 1930s were the era of the celebrity gangster. John Dillinger and Babyface Nelson dominated the headlines. Their crimes were spectacular, public, and in a strange way, understandable. They were about money and power. The crimes of Albert Fish were quiet, private, and born of a motivation so alien it was literally unthinkable. Who could conceive of a grandfatherly figure who ate children? The concept was so far beyond the pale of normal human experience that it could not be processed. Neighbors who may have noticed strange smells or sounds would have rationalized them away. Police departments, underfunded and overwhelmed, focused on tangible threats. Fish operated in a blind spot, a lacuna in the collective imagination. His greatest protection was not his cunning, but the simple, horrifying fact that no one was looking for a monster like him, because no one believed such a monster could exist. The first cracks in his fortress of anonymity were not forced by police work or forensic science, but by the stubborn, unyielding grief of a single family. The Budd family refused to let Grace become a forgotten statistic. For 6 long years, they kept her memory alive. They pestered the police. They followed up on every false lead. Her older brother, Edward, who had been there the day Frank Howard charmed his way into their lives, never stopped searching. This persistent familial love was the one external pressure Fish had not accounted for. He could vanish from a city, but he could not erase himself from the memory of those he had wronged. Their grief was a constant, low-level hum of pursuit. The fatal internal pressure came from the monster itself. The pathology that drove Fish to kill also demanded recognition. His horrific acts were, in his mind, masterpieces of piety and cruelty. The artist, having completed his work, felt the irresistible urge to explain it, to claim it. His arrogance, fortified by years of successful evasion, led him to make a catastrophic error. In November 1934, 6 years after he had murdered Grace Budd, he sat down and wrote a letter. It was addressed to Delia Budd, Grace's mother. The letter was a rambling, semi-literate screed, but it contained details of Grace's abduction, murder, and cannibalism so specific and grotesque that they could only have been known by the killer. He described, in stomach-turning detail, how he had cooked and eaten her body over a period of 9 days. He wrote it to torment a grieving mother, but in doing so, he signed his own death warrant. That letter was the breakthrough. It was a piece of tangible evidence in a case that had been cold for half a decade. Delia Budd, horrified, immediately took it to the police. The letter was a psychological confession, but it was also a physical clue. At the bottom of the cheap stationery was a small, circular emblem, the insignia of the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. The case landed on the desk of Detective William King of the Missing Persons Bureau. King was a patient, methodical investigator, and he seized upon this single, improbable clue. The letter was Fish's greatest act of hubris, a boast whispered from the shadows. Detective King was about to turn that whisper into a name. The raid, when it came, was devoid of drama. It was the quiet, almost mundane end to a reign of spectacular horror. Detective King's investigation was a masterpiece of old-fashioned police work. He tracked down the company that had printed the stationery. He obtained a list of every employee who had received it. He began the laborious process of cross-referencing names and addresses. He discovered that a former employee, a man whose description matched the one given by the Budd family, had lived at a particular address but had since moved. The new tenants, however, knew where he had gone, a shabby rooming house at 200 East 52nd Street. On December 13, 1934, King went to the address and waited. Soon an elderly, stooped man shuffled down the street. It was him. King approached him calmly. "Are you Albert Fish?" The old man nodded. When told he was wanted for the abduction of Grace Budd, his response was chillingly simple. "I don't know why I'm not in the electric chair." The monster had been unmasked, and it seemed almost relieved. The accounting began in a police interrogation room. Fish's confession was a torrent of depravity, a guided tour through his labyrinthine mind. He spoke of his crimes not with remorse, but with a kind of placid, grandfatherly pride. He recounted the details of Grace Budd's murder with the dispassionate air of a man describing a day at the office. He confessed to other murders, his memory a foggy catalog of atrocities. The physical evidence found in his room corroborated his stories. Police discovered knives, a meat cleaver, and the nail-studded paddle he used for his self-flagellations. But the most shocking discovery came from a medical examination. An X-ray of his pelvis revealed a constellation of foreign objects. There were at least 29 needles embedded deep in his flesh, a permanent internal record of his lifelong obsession with pain. It was a radiographic map of his soul. The trial of Albert Fish was a national sensation, a public confrontation with an evil that defied easy explanation. The press dubbed him the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, and the Gray Man. His defense team, led by attorney James Dempsey, argued that Fish was clearly criminally insane. They presented his family history of mental illness, his religious delusions, his grotesque self-mutilation. How could a man with needles in his pelvis who claimed God commanded him to kill and eat children be considered sane? The prosecution, however, argued that Fish, while undoubtedly a deviant, understood the nature of his acts and knew they were wrong. He had used false names, fled crime scenes, and hidden his activities for years. All signs of a rational mind aware of its own guilt. Fish himself took the stand, his calm, detailed testimony horrifying the courtroom. The jury deliberated for just over an hour. They found him sane and guilty. Sentenced to die in the electric chair at Sing Prison, Fish showed no emotion. He had spent his life chasing the ultimate synthesis of pain and pleasure. Now the state was going to give it to him. For the survivors and families, the verdict brought a grim and incomplete closure. The Budd family had justice for Grace, but it was a justice steeped in the horrifying knowledge of her final days. For the families of Billy Gaffney and countless others, Fish's capture provided a name for their nightmare, but no bodies to bury, no final resting place to visit. His own children were left to grapple with an impossible inheritance, the knowledge that the father they had known was a mask worn by one of history's most depraved monsters. They were survivors of a different kind, their lives forever defined by the shadow of his crimes. The case of Albert Fish revealed not a criminal cover-up, but a series of profound systemic failures. It exposed the vulnerabilities of the poor in a society that barely acknowledged their existence. It highlighted the inadequacy of law enforcement in an era before centralized databases and interagency cooperation. It underscored the failure of the mental health and social welfare systems, from the abusive orphanage that nurtured his pathology to the lack of intervention in his adult life. The true number of his victims remains his final dark secret. His confessions were unreliable, his memory clouded by delusion. He is a black hole in the criminal record, having pulled an unknown number of lives in with him, leaving behind only speculation and grief. The cultural legacy of Albert Fish is that of a cautionary tale in its most extreme form. He became a new benchmark for human cruelty, a boogeyman whose real-life atrocities surpassed the darkest inventions of fiction. His story has been dissected in books, documentaries, and academic papers, a case study in sadism, religious psychosis, and the failure of the human facade. He forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that monstrosity does not always announce itself with fangs and claws. Sometimes it arrives with a gentle smile, a kind word, and the offer of a helping hand. He is a permanent fixture in the darkest corners of American folklore, a reminder of the abyss that can open up beneath the floorboards of the ordinary world. What, in the end, does the gray man teach us? He reveals the terrifying fragility of the human mind and the myriad ways it can be twisted by trauma, inheritance, and belief. He demonstrates that evil is not always a grand operatic force, but can be a quiet, methodical, and deeply personal sickness. His story is a stark warning against the dangers of indifference, showing how predators thrive when society is too preoccupied, too fragmented, or too callous to protect its most vulnerable. We are left with the chilling question: are we any better at seeing the gray men who walk among us today? Remembering the story of Albert Fish is not about sensationalism, it is an act of witness. It is about honoring Grace Budd, Billy Gaffney, and all the nameless others, and acknowledging our collective responsibility to look closer, to listen harder, and to never again allow the whispers of suffering to be mistaken for silence.